I'd forgotten what rush hour traffic in Gainesville was like. I'll be doing my next teaching series on hell.
Don't ever move to Jackson.
No. Our topic tonight, the first lesson in a 4-week class on heresy. What I want to do tonight is put together like a skeleton, just the basics, present you with some basic ideas, and then over the next 3 weeks, put some meat on the skeleton and flesh things out a little bit. And a good place to start is with some definitions. Some words that come to mind when we think about heresy. Heresy, apostasy, and blasphemy. We're only going to be talking about one of them. Blasphemy. Blasphemy is when intentionally you show disrespect or a lack of... Well, we can do it this way. Blasphemy is when intentionally you show disregard or disrespect or a lack of reverence for something sacred. We're not going to talk about blasphemy tonight. We're just using the word, getting it out of the way, and moving on. There you go. Now, another word which might come up tonight, apostasy. There's a difference between apostasy and heresy. Apostasy means to give up and to reject a religion that you once held, a religious view that you once held. You've moved entirely outside of the religion. You've said, I'm no longer Jewish, I'm no longer Christian, I'm no longer a Muslim. You moved entirely outside of the religion. The touchy ground, where we'll be for 4 weeks, is with heresy. Heresy means choosing to follow another interpretation rather than the official interpretation, especially in religious belief, although we use the word heresy in political contexts and all kinds of things, but we're focusing on religion. A couple of things about the word heresy here. A big question is, where does heresy end and apostasy begin? In other words, when do you hold enough heresy that you've actually moved out of the religion altogether? And I have to say, I'm very glad I'm not God and I don't have to make those kind of decisions. There's not a strict line. It's not for me to judge when somebody has gone too far in heresy. And the counterpoint to that is that one can be a Christian and be a heretic, but they will be wrong. And they'll be judged for their wrongness. But more than being wrong, they're cheating themselves. And that's really the point of the course over these 4 weeks. The other thing I wanted to point out about this word heresy is the root of the word to choose. Choosing to follow a teaching at variance with the teaching of official religious belief. Heresy is choosing. It's more than just being wrong. Because I hate to break it to us, all of us are wrong about something. Okay? When it comes to understanding our faith, all of us are wrong about something. But heresy is understanding what the official standard is and saying, no, I'm going to believe this instead. And this is a point made by a great Anglican bishop, Jeremy Taylor, from the 17th century. Heresy, he writes, is not a failure of the understanding, but a failure of the will. That's just a fancy way of saying that heresy is choosing to follow a different path. You know what the standard of the faith is, but you choose to walk a separate path. So there are people who hold heretical views, probably all of us, on something. But that's different from saying, I understand what the teaching of the church is, but I'm deciding to walk in this way. I'm deciding to believe this instead. When we look at heresy specifically in a Christian context, there are 2 different ways of looking at it. One is to look at how heresy works in its sociological and historical and theological and philosophical framework. And that is to look at the first 5 centuries of Christian development, Christian theological development, to hold that up as the standard and to say and to decide where we deviate from that standard. That 5 centuries, the first 500 years, encompasses the first 4 ecumenical councils, which will come up in the next few weeks, no more tonight, but in the next few weeks. It'll encompass the big creeds of the church, the Nicene and the Apostle, the Athanasian Creed. And so the consensus which is reached over those 500 years. 500 years is a long time. And there are a lot of specific heresies which arise over that 500-year time period. We'll be looking at several of them by name in the course, but this is an approach which focuses on scholarship and research and studying and that kind of thing. But there's another approach to thinking about heresy in a Christian context. And that is in a pastoral context. A very different way of thinking about things than whether this or that lines up with this belief from the 5th century. And that is to think about heresy in a pastoral way. To think about heresy as following an attractive understanding of Jesus, which draws our attention and attracts us, and yet this understanding of Jesus is going to be cruel because it ends up in a position where we have no gospel at all. And right away, and I've already had jokes and jokes about the topic of heresy, you're fighting an uphill battle in 21st century America when you start talking about heresy. Because heresy is really cool, right? It's really hip. There's a big video game heresy, Horus Heresy, I think. It's cool to be a heretic. The perception from silly movies like the Da Vinci Code and that kind of thing is that the heretics really understood things. But the official church puts down the secret knowledge which would hold everybody, let everybody free and all that sort of thing. So we're fighting kind of a PR battle because the heretics are cool, okay? And even some theologians in the church who've practiced heresy take the title proudly. Some older books here. James Pike, an Anglican heretic, with his self-titled book, with the titled book "If This Be Heresy," which it was. Walter Kaufman, Presbyterian, "The Faith of a Heretic." For a while, it was cool if you questioned official doctrine to take that title freely and proclaim it, and there's a sense of authority because now I'm self-proclaiming myself to be a heretic. But I think that if we take this pastoral approach, there's an awful lot to think about here. I've shrunk down the sociological and theological stuff because I really do want to focus on, not on the mind, but on the heart. What attracts us to these understandings of Jesus which end up leading us to a cruel position where we have no Savior and no salvation and no hope at all. And these understandings are attractive, and that's what I want to focus on tonight. The attraction of these false understandings of Jesus that lead us away from a gospel which provides salvation for us and leads us to a place of cruelty where there is no hope and no salvation at all. And the key, if you look at that definition there, has to do with an understanding of Jesus. Who is Jesus? Which is the big question, okay? Who is Jesus? Well, if I ask you who is Jesus, where should we start? Let's start with the Bible. That sounds like a good place to start. And so we'll look around the house and try to remember where we left it and eventually find it and look in there because surely the Bible will tell us who is Jesus. And so we open our Bibles up to, let's say, John's Gospel, where we read, "I and the Father are one." Well, that can't be much more clear than that. Mathematical identity. One and one. One is always one. One is always one. I'm no good at math, but I talk the lingo, okay? If Chris Porter were still here, he's a philosopher of mathematics at UF, he would explain to you how one is always one and mathematical identity, one-to-one correlation, mathematical identity. I and the Father are one. You can't get much more clear than that. Just a few pages over, Jesus expands on this idea. He who has seen me has seen the Father. Again, we have this complete identity between the Father and Jesus. And then just a few verses later, the Father is greater than I. Okay, maybe earlier in John, Jesus clarified all of this. Or a little bit later, Thomas meeting the resurrected Lord says, "My Lord and my God." You can't get much clearer than that. And yet in the same gospel, Jesus cries. Is God kind of a crying kind of guy? Jesus is thirsty. Does God get thirsty? Maybe Paul can help us out here. Who is Jesus? Well, Paul says that God the Father sent his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. So I guess that means Jesus is kind of like human. He's like sinful flesh. A little bit later, Paul writes that he's being born in the likeness of men, being found in human form. So I guess Paul is saying Jesus is like a human, formed like a human. We can pick any of these verses and reach several different understandings, answers. Question, who is Jesus? And you can see them there. And I can pull out a verse here or there to support these understandings of Jesus. That Jesus is a good man who was used in some way by God. It's a standard line of liberal Protestant theology. That Jesus is the physical son of a physical God on earth. Our Mormon friends say that or something close to it. Jesus is God but pretended to be a man, a form of man. Jesus is a man who somehow becomes God, becomes divine. Or Jesus is somehow both God and human. Or Jesus is human, but he's so devoted to God that God's Spirit fills him and God acts directly through Jesus. Not all of these views are heretical, but they're all views that we can pick a verse here or there and put something together. The point is not, therefore, the Bible contradicts itself on who Jesus is. The point is you have to use reason to organize the message of Jesus and to come to a complete understanding of who Jesus is. It doesn't help us to just pull some verses out, slap something together, and say that we now understand who Jesus is. Well, I gave you however many that ended up being 5 heresies up there out of 6 choices. And there are an awful lot of other ones. But to make things simple, and especially for the first night of a 4-week series, there are really only 2 basic heresies. Really only 2 basic heresies. They have fancy names, Docetism and Adoptionism. Those are fancy names for the 2 basic heresies. The first basic heresy, called Docetism, that comes from a Greek word that means to appear. This is the idea that Jesus appeared like a human being. He seemed to be human, but Jesus is God. Jesus is God. But to those around him, he appeared to be human. He pretended to be thirsty. Although we know that God can't be thirsty. I mean, the Bible says that God is a spirit, right? And spirits don't get thirsty. We assume spirits don't get thirsty. Okay. And so he appears to be human, but he's not. And especially, and most importantly for this view, Jesus can't suffer. Can God suffer? I mean, he's the most powerful being in the universe. How can God suffer? And especially, God can never die. How could God die? It doesn't make an awful lot of sense. So our starting point for Docetism is with an understanding that Jesus is God. And as he walked around, he looked human. He appeared to be human. But yet he couldn't die, and he couldn't suffer, and especially that he couldn't die. I'll expand on that in just a little bit. The second basic heresy is what's called adoptionism. In this view, Jesus is human. Okay, Jesus is human, but through being a good person, being a man with a pure soul, at some point, usually baptism of Jesus, Jesus is adopted as God's Son and becomes, in a way, divine. And so because Jesus was human, he did suffer, he did die, but he's rewarded for his suffering because he becomes like a God. He becomes divine. And as odd or strange as these ideas might seem to you, these are the two basic heresies in the history of Christianity. I want to look first at Docetism and then at adoptionism. Oops, wrong button. Glad I didn't put somebody's eye out. There we go. Docetism. Again, it comes from a Greek word that means to appear. That's just the basic idea, that Jesus appears to be a human being. Jesus is God, but he appears as a human being, and especially he could not suffer, and he did not suffer. And the hope of Docetic Christianity is that by identifying with Jesus, we can learn the secrets so that we don't have to suffer. That's the attractiveness. You're wondering about the attractiveness. Well, you know what's attractive about this image? Well, the attractiveness is that somehow, by uniting myself with Jesus, I can escape suffering. Jesus escaped suffering. Jesus is God. He can do whatever he wants to. So he can fix things so that I don't have to suffer. And especially, Jesus could not die. Well, if Jesus is God, God couldn't die. That's the thought process. You understand, I'm not mocking the rationality or the reasoning here. I mean, it's wrong, but it's a conclusion that can be reached, okay? And he couldn't die. So how do we deal with the crucifixion from this perspective? As odd as it might sound, I know it's going to sound pretty odd to you, okay? Most forms of Docetism end up with somebody substituting for Jesus. Now, Orthodox Christianity has Jesus substituting for everybody, right? But Docetic Christianity has somebody substituting for Jesus. I know this sounds weird to you, okay? But there are forms of Docetic Christianity where on the way to Calvary, you remember when Simon of Cyrene picks up the cross and carries it? Docetic Christianity holds that it's during that time that Jesus disappears, goes back to heaven. Simon of Cyrene carries the cross and is crucified as Jesus. There are other Docetic heretics who say Judas is crucified instead of Jesus. Somehow the disciples play a trick on Judas. Judas ends up being crucified instead of Jesus. There's the view that I call zombie Jesus, that God inhabits a human body and so absorbs the human body that God pulls out of the human body, and there's just this kind of animal who looks human, who is kind of like a zombie, doesn't know where, and nailed to the cross and all of that. These ideas might sound weird to you, but here's this. It's probably likely that most people in the world today who think of Jesus religiously hold something like that, because that's the understanding that Islam has of Jesus. The Prophet Isa in Arabic, that's the understanding Islam has of Jesus. And there are still large groups of Nestorian Christians, they're called Rukhat Nestorianism, who hold that view, that Jesus was that Jesus could not suffer on the cross. In some way, however you fix it, some substitute ended up being replaced. As weird as that sounds, most people in the world today who think of Jesus in a religious way think that's what happened, something like that happened on the cross. The big point here is that obviously Jesus couldn't suffer. And if we identify with Jesus, then we can avoid suffering. Despite all the scriptures which talk about what Paul calls the fellowship of his suffering. If we suffer with Jesus, we will reign with him. Over and over again, I'm not going to go through and preach all these verses, but over and over again, Paul especially talks about how in suffering we follow Jesus. Jesus suffered, we can follow him. the references to Peter there are that because we suffer, we should give thanks. Why? Because we're learning how Jesus walked through his life. There's a full developed theology of suffering in the New Testament that is just avoided here. And I think there's two reasons why, despite what the New Testament has to say about suffering, this ascetic view of Jesus is so attractive. For one thing, there's just the basic human desire to avoid suffering. We can identify with that, okay? And somehow, if I unite myself to Jesus, then I can avoid suffering, I can avoid death. But there's an awful lot more, too. It's kind of interesting that it's nearly 400 years after the crucifixion of Jesus before crucifixion scenes show up in Christian art. If I asked you, what would be the most Christian painting you can imagine? Probably, well, I guess a crucifixion scene. I guess that would be it. It's about 400 years before they show up. At least in the Roman world. Because when you can see a man crucified to a cross as simply as walking down to your street corner, there's really no point in making a little pretty silver picture of it and putting it on a chain around your neck. Crucifixions in the Roman Empire are a common thing. Something if you don't see every day, at least every month. There's noise, you look over, and there's another bad guy. The cops caught a bad guy breaking into a house. They hauled him out, nailed him to a board, and stuck him up in a tree somewhere to tell everybody you don't want to do this. It's a horrible, horrible thing. And so it's easy to understand why they would avoid talking about it. And it's easy to understand why this desire to have Jesus not be like that. These are people who walk down the street and see a crucifixion. They say, I don't want God to have done that. But it's about 400 years before we see crucifixion scenes. And we don't see very many of them at that point. It's not until the 9th century, the 800s, that we start to see crucifixion scenes all over the place. And by now, Rome's been gone for 300 years. Okay. There are two competitors for the earliest known Christian art picturing the crucifixion. Both of them come from the 420s. It's a toss-up as to which one's the earliest. This will be, eventually. I should have checked this battery. The Basilica of St. Sabina in Rome. It's not exactly a cathedral, but it's a very fancy, famous church in Rome. This is one of these churches in Rome. Father Alex mentioned this in a sermon maybe 6 months ago, where you have a house church, a woman named Sabina, and she had the church meeting in her home, and then she dies, but everybody just keeps showing up at Sabina's house, because that's where everybody has church, and eventually more people show up, so they add on buildings, and eventually Christianity's legalized. You can have official places, tear down the old house church, and put up this fancy church. Sabina's buried on the well, I guess she's long gone now, but her body was buried on the grounds there. The structure's been redone several times, but the main structure is from the 420s. There you see the inside of the church. It's been redone an awful lot. The painting and apse, the circle up there is from the 17th century, I think. This is Roman architecture. It's a famous church. Thomas Aquinas lived on the property for a while, did a lot of writing there. I mean, it's a well-known church. One of the interesting things for us tonight is the doors to the church. You see the columns here. That gives you some idea of the size of the door. The actual doors that open up are below where I'm pointing with the laser here. Everything above is sculpted, a solid piece, or not solid, but it doesn't open up. Okay, and so this line on the doors is about the line there on that door. I would imagine maybe a little bit larger because it's kind of fancy. All right. There are several scenes on the door. This is way up high here. I guess we could play a guessing game, but we won't. This is Jesus and the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, explaining how the Old Testament points to Jesus. This one, I'm not sure you can really see. It's Elijah going up into heaven. Here's the angel calling Elijah. Elijah's on a chariot. I'm not sure you can make that out. Elisha is grabbing the cloak. pulling the cloak off of Elijah here. Here is the sculpture part of the door. And you up here, it does have a crucifixion scene. Want to know where it is? It's a little bit up here. Isn't that strange? It's just a little bit up here. And the crucifixion scene is maybe the strangest crucifixion scene you've ever seen. There it is. It's missing some things. What's one thing it's missing? Crosses. There's no cross. Okay? There are, I'm not sure you can see them, there are nails in the palms of the hands. The first thought is, well, it's got to be something else. But there are you see, I'm not sure you can see them, but there are spike heads there, but no cross. And there's no suffering. I think I've got, yeah, that. This face over here looks kind of weird. I think it's the lighting, though. I've seen different angles of it. It's not quite so weird. But there's no suffering. There's not even any cross. These are people who are remembering Jesus was crucified, but who are avoiding the cross and all of the suffering. I'm not going to point to this and say, therefore, this artist was a Docetist. Okay, but I'm saying that's that desire to, okay, you got Jesus was crucified. We'll put him way up there where you can't really notice him, just to remember. There's a way of avoiding this topic. The other competitors, the other competitor for the earliest is some ivory casket panels. The casket's long since been taken apart from the 420s. Here you see Pilate washing his hands. Over here is the rooster getting ready to crow. Here's somebody pointing at Peter. Here's Jesus out for a morning stroll, carrying his cross around town. Walking by Peter. Hey, Peter, yeah, I know you denied me, but we're still good. We're still good. Not a great deal of suffering here. And the crucifixion scene itself, there's not suffering here, and I'm not quite sure I'd even say a dead body. Is it the case that the artist here doesn't know how to capture a dead body? No, there's Judas hanging from the tree. We're not puzzled at all by the death being depicted over here, and yet here's Jesus without suffering, without dying, kind of pretending, hey, I'm up here, but everything's okay. If it's not exactly Docetism, it's influenced by the same idea. We can see Docetism in more modern works of art as well. Here's Salvador Dali's Last Supper. It is a beautiful painting, but it's an heretical painting, but it is beautiful. If you have a chance to see it, the last time I saw it, it's in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It's actually in a staircase, but that's a good thing because you start off on one floor and you walk up and you turn around, you can see it from different angles all the way up and then look down and kind of across at it. It's a beautiful painting, but it's a heretical painting. Up here we have this body which starts off being solid and then kind of disappears. It kind of disappears through here. And then I know it's far away. Whoops, there we go. You have this body up here, which again begins to fade away. And then here's Jesus' body, but as you look at Jesus' body, you can see the fishing boat through it. I'm not sure it's showing up for you there, but you can see the mountain landscape behind him. This is someone who's appearing to be human, but isn't human. And again, it's a beautiful painting. I'm not criticizing the art technique here. I think it communicates very well, but what it communicates is a heretical view of Jesus here. And a Jesus that you can see through, a being from outer space that you can see through, may be able to bring me words of wisdom, may be able to tell me I need to love people more or something like that, but he doesn't know what it's like to be me. He doesn't understand what it's like to be human. He can't give me advice that will affect my life, okay? He can give me like nice sounding stuff, but he can't really understand what it's like to be me. Or another painting by Dali. Here we have a Jesus kind of floating up there, not attached to the cross, certainly not a lot of suffering, completely disconnected from the disciple here, I'm sure Mary Magdalene. This world down here, which is laid out in like a checkerboard pattern, the rationality and the geometric shapes, and up above in some mystical kind of way, here's a Jesus who's not suffering, not even attached to the cross, not even any attempt to capture being nailed to the cross. A being who appears to be human and can kind of hover next to the cross may have all kinds of insights into something, but really doesn't speak to me in a way that I can understand things. Now, this is different from what you may have seen, a depiction of Christus Rex or Christus Victor, it's sometimes called, where you have Jesus in the vestments of a prophet with vestments of a priest with the crown of a king. But that's a different, obviously no one's trying to pretend that Jesus was crucified in priest vestments and crowns. It's showing victory over the cross, and another depiction here. That's a different idea than this idea that Jesus kind of hovers up next to the cross and never really suffers, never really dies. May have some words of wisdom for me, but I can't really identify with him. This painting here? Yeah. The Christus Rex, Christus Victor. Yeah. The movie Jesus of Nazareth, which came out in 1977, is supposed to be the high mark of the Jesus movies. Everything since gets compared back to this TV miniseries, actually. Intentionally, the actor who plays Jesus was told by the director to avoid blinking while he's being filmed. For the miniseries is 6.5 hours, and there are film aficionados who watch frame by frame to try to catch Jesus, the character of Jesus, blinking, and they argue over, I think he might have blinked here. But the idea is that he was told to try not to blink, and then every time he did blink, the film was edited or cut to another character, and the reviews were just exploded that this portrayed Jesus as an otherworldly being. It showed his mystical connection to God. But a Jesus who goes through life never blinking, doesn't really connect to me. Okay. And what we have, and I'm going to flesh this out in some later talks, are really two different results, two different ending points from this mindset. We either end up with a false distinction between the spiritual and the physical, where the spiritual is really important and we really care about people's spiritual lives, but we don't really so much care about the physical life. Or we've run across this one, right? People who are spiritual but who aren't religious. They want to be spiritual, but they don't want the hassle and the frustration and the responsibility of being religious, and so they're spiritual, and they want to separate a spiritual life from a life of following set doctrines and that sort of thing. Or, and again, we'll see examples of this in the next 3 weeks, we have, this leads to the idea that we can fix our problems by escaping life in some way. I'm afraid an awful lot of monks and nuns entered the monastery hoping they could escape suffering by escaping the rest of the world. Okay, not all of them, but an awful lot of them, I'm afraid, have that idea that if you escape the rest of the world, then you won't suffer. And what this ultimately ends up with is solving the problem that we all have because we're human by destroying something human about us or about humanity itself. I can't fill all that in tonight, but that's what we'll be looking at as we move forward. The other basic heresy, adoptionism, which holds that Jesus is human, and then because he's a good person or because he's purified his soul or somehow God adopts him as God's son and he becomes divine, he becomes God in some way, and that Jesus does suffer, but his reward for all this suffering is that he becomes divine. And nearly all the adoptionist heresies start with the idea, the false belief that Jesus is adopted at his baptism. Then I just pulled up Matthew's account there, where Jesus is baptized, the voice from heaven speaks and says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." And the adoptionist heresies hold that it's at this point that Jesus becomes divine and is able to perform miracles and healings and all that sort of thing. But he starts off as the son of Mary and Joseph, like anybody else is born, but through the purity of his heart or through his following the law or through his moral behavior, he reaches a point where God is able to adopt him, and somehow he becomes divine. And in this understanding of Jesus, Jesus becomes our model. Jesus is an example of what we should be. We should, in this model, try harder. If we're not quite reaching where we want to be spiritually, we should try harder. We should do better. We should activate our will so that we overcome evil around us. We fight temptation, and we reach a point of perfection, and then we reach a point of divinity. Or I have up there the very first temptation, to become like gods. This is the root of a lot of sin, is wanting to be like God, wanting to create our own world. That's what stealing is about. I want to create a world where I own that and you don't. That's what murder is about. I want to create a world where you no longer live. And this is a desire to create a world, lying. I want to create a world where everybody believes my view of things is the truth. Okay? And here we have the desire to create a world where I can be righteous. Create a world where I'm judged righteous because of what I've done. And when we look, and we will over the next 3 weeks, we see again two kind of different results of this line of thought. We either end up becoming very self-righteous because we want to become like gods. We want to create our own world where we're recognized as being righteous. Or else we lower standards to our own level. And as you look at what the adoptionists have to say about Jesus' teaching, they always want to soft pedal everything. Well, when Jesus says you must be perfect, what he really means is you got to try hard. Lowering those expectations. One heretical Anglican pastor in the 1700s wrote, Jesus lowers the moral market. What he meant was that because of Jesus, then we don't have to really meet God's standards anymore. He lowers the moral market. The value of our good things is we don't have to work as hard and try as hard. There's either this resulting in self-righteousness, or else there's the result of despair. Because no matter how much you want to become God, you can't become God. And if you try to follow all the rules that you can become divine, that you can become a God, oftentimes you end up in despair and in self-condemnation. And I started off with the idea that these heresies end up in cruelty. And here's what I mean by this. Ultimately, by the end of our time together, we'll see the end results of each of these basic heresies as they play themselves out, and it ends up being the same. The basic answer to this basic question, who is Jesus, ends up being different in the details, but eventually reaches the conclusion that Jesus is someone who can't save me. Jesus is someone who can't save me because either in the ascetic view, because he's completely perfect, he never suffers, he never dies, there's no way to live up to his standards. Or in adoptionism, Jesus cannot save me because I have to save myself. I have to try harder, I have to work harder. And dealing with all the intellectual arguments of how these heresies arise and where they conflict is interesting and important, but I'd rather in these next few weeks keep us focused on that pastoral approach to thinking about these heresies. If we get wrong in how we're thinking about Jesus, where do we end up? And all too often, as we're going to see, we end up with a Jesus who can't save us. And that's where I'd like to leave us off tonight. Questions or comments or responses?
Sure helps to read the Bible. See what it said. And it's on post-it.
Right. Yeah. Tim said it's better to read the Bible than to listen to what someone else thinks it says. I think that's the thing it says. And it's also what somebody pulls out of one spot to try to build a whole system out of one verse is pulled out of one place. And I hope that you'll come to realize that this 500-year period is there's a lot of arguing and struggling, but it's people who are devoted to figuring out who is Jesus. And all along, the answer from the church is that's not the Jesus we know. The Jesus who we know is not somebody who just appears to be human, is not somebody who God adopted. Over and over, it doesn't match up with the church's experience of who Jesus is. Ken?
Where does, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, fit into this paradigm?
Well, you can understand that in different ways. If you start off with a twisted way of thinking about things, you might say that spirit of the Word is given to Jesus at baptism, and so there's this divine spirit which is given to Jesus at baptism, and that Spirit of God inhabits Jesus' body. That would be one of the adoptionist views.
There seems to be a view of Jesus in the Bible that is beyond his 3 years here on earth, and that seems to be what these two things are all focusing on, making a judgment upon that time, that those years of the ministry. Is that right?
I think that's a good insight. Ken suggests that both of these views are making an awful lot of that time before Jesus' public ministry of 3 years, a time that we don't know an awful lot about. And Ken didn't say this, but making stuff up about these early years flows into these heresies. I like that idea. I'm going to steal it. I like it. Yeah. We'll get to Gnosticism, and a lot of the Gnostic Gospels are about Jesus' youth and childhood, infancy narratives. I like that. Glenn.
I think that the idea of Jesus that I hear most often is that he wasn't God, and that if there is a God, he doesn't specify. He's disconnected from Jesus, I guess, because he weighs the good and the bad that you've done, and I'm a pretty good person, so I'm acceptable to God. Is that a heresy, or is that just atheism?
It probably wouldn't quite be atheism. That might be actually so heretical, it may just cross over into apostasy. It may not even be a Christian idea. I think I would be tempted to go along that line of thought, that it may be a lot of happy thinking that uses the name Jesus, but really it isn't really an organized religious expression. But you're right. I think that's the dominant view of Jesus as, a good guy, but not really connected to me, and somehow God looks at what I did, and I'm a good person.
Isn't it a heresy talking about Jesus? What about views of God that I run into frequently? There's people who say, yes, Jesus is God, but so is what the Muslims worship, the Jews worship, what the Hindus worship. That's all God. Is that heresy? In other words, God is much bigger than the Lord, the Father of Jesus Christ. God is the entity that the Indians worship, that everybody worships.
Yeah, I think actually you just hit on the key there. Ken is talking about the idea that everybody worships the same God, I think is summarized. Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists. There's some ignorance in that Hindus and Buddhists, well, Buddhists explicitly don't worship God. I mean, they say they don't believe that God exists. There's just something some people say. Buddhists and worship the same God, and no Buddhist would say that he worships God. There's two answers to that question, Ken, and it goes like this. In a sense, everybody does worship the same God because there's only one God. So in that sense, it's not like Allah is another God out there, okay? I mean, we would agree on that. It's not like Christians worship God the Father and there's another God out there named Allah that the Muslims worship. I know we would agree on that. And so in that sense, everybody worships the same God. They may be worshiping falsely or whatever. In that sense, it is the same God because there's only one God. In another sense, though, not everybody worships the same God, because I can ask a Muslim imam, do you and I worship the same God? And he would likely say yes. And I said, well, the God that I worship is the Father Jesus. And so your God must be the Father Jesus too. And he would say, well, no. And I said, well, that's the God that I worship is the Father of Jesus. So in that sense, we wouldn't be worshiping the same God. Does that make sense?
I have difficulty with it. I would think that I've always held in mind, and I'm no scholar on heresy, but I always thought that if you worship God, and your God included somebody besides the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, that was heresy. And,
well, okay, come back to heresy. I think it would again be, it wouldn't be, I don't think it would be organized thought enough to be heretical. Again, it would just be a different religious system altogether, if I'm understanding correctly. So I don't think it would be an heretical idea within Christianity. I think it would be a different religious system altogether. I think it would be wrong as well. I should clarify that. Yeah, Libby?
So in these two kind of systems, where does the Holy Spirit get in there? Because I mean, it seems like either one of those. How do they fit the Holy Spirit into that? Because it really doesn't fit. Do they have a place for in this system?
So, I think the simplest answer to say so far no. So far no. As we look at that first 500-year time period, the first big issue is this one: who is Jesus? And then, as usual, the Holy Spirit is kind of an afterthought. We see that in the Nicene Creed, right? I believe in God the Father, this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this. I believe in Jesus, this, and this, and this. Oh, yeah, the Holy Spirit too. Better stick him in. So I don't think the Holy Spirit as a distinct person of the Trinity is really figuring in here. Will by the end of the course, but not quite yet. Jim.
What about the Essenes? How did they differ from it? They were about the same time as Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And some people think that maybe Jesus was one of their adherents, and some don't. I mean, how do they fit in?
Yeah, Jim is asking about the Essenes. And how the Essenes might fit into early Christian heresies. That's...
I mean, they must have had some heresy which they differed from the standard Jewish.
Right. The Essenes would differ from your ordinary run-of-the-mill Jewish people. I'm going to come back to that. I'm not quite sure how to... Thinking about how the Essenes relate to early Christian heresies, I'm not quite sure.
What I'm having, what's the difference between? There's a difference between heresy and wrong thinking.
Yes.
And if I'm getting this right, the heresy is a choice to believe other than what the church believes.
Yes. Yeah.
Ken, you may have missed because he started with that at the very beginning. I don't know that you were here yet. We talked about apostasy versus.
Yeah. Anne?
Let me go back. What you're saying is that heresy is a Christian, someone who considers himself a Christian who believes heretical teachings about Christianity. So if you're a Muslim, you can't be a heretic. You can't be a heretic. You can be a Muslim heretic of the Muslim teachings, but not of the Christian teachings. You have to be a Christian to be a Christian heretic.
That's true. That's true. Although that might not be the best example. Islam, until the 20th century, was seen as a Christian heresy. That's a very interesting thing. It was not until the 20th century that it began to be identified as a separate religion. When Muhammad is chased out of Mecca before he gets to Medina, I think I got that right, he spends time in Ethiopia, and everybody just thought he was a Docetic Christian preacher. Everybody thought that he was just a Christian heretic. In Dante's Purgatorio, Muhammad shows up not in hell but in purgatory with all the other Christian heretics to be purified of their heresy so they can enter heaven. The idea, St. Francis tried to minister to Saladin, who's by St. Yeah, and with the understanding that his understanding that it was just that this was all a misunderstanding about basic Christian doctrine, and never considered that Islam was a separate religion. So I think you're right, Anne. It's just kind of like not the best example because that brings up the historical connections between Islam and Christianity. That
They would have called themselves Christian. These heretics early.
yes, yeah, yes. The question was the early church heretics would call themselves Christians, and certainly would. Yeah, and I should say many of the heretics were nice people. No, seriously, we're nice people.
Very smart.
Be very smart people, and as you chase out, as you track through, oftentimes heretics are arguing against another heresy, and then end up becoming heretics trying to defend Orthodox belief. It's not that the heretics are trying to destroy something; it's that they're rejecting what the church has reached by consensus and chasing a different understanding of Jesus. Tim?
The heresy is determined by what you believe is right and what the world believes is right. What's one person's heretic is another person's true believer. So someone has to determine what is the standard and what becomes a heresy.
I think as we look at heresies, we see where they end up. And I think even if we just borrow the relativistic ground for a little while, even if we allow heresy to develop and see where it ends up, it'll end up in these situations of despair, self-righteousness, and so on. So I think the proof is in the pudding kind of applies to heresy. If it's left to develop, it'll end up in one of these poisonous
But as a result,
mindsets.
you always have to go back to the Bible and see what the Bible said, not what someone else believes it said.
I think it's fair to say we always need to go back and do that. And the creeds can become idolatrous. I mean, I grew up in a Christian tradition where your status with God is that you're right. If you're right, then you're okay with God. Because there's all this fight over who's right. It took me a long time to try to figure out I didn't always have to be right all the time. But the creeds can become idolatrous where doctrinal standards are what we worship. But the creed doesn't hang on the cross. The creeds set the boundaries for thinking about the one who did hang on the cross.
It seems almost like what they're trying to do in these two heresies is almost dumb Christianity down so that they can understand it. On the one hand, Jesus is just, he was adopted. We can understand that. And in the other one, well, we can understand that Jesus was like this. And so that's what it seems to me like they're trying to do. Jesus just enough so they can get their heads around it.
Yeah, Mary's suggesting that the heresies are trying to make Jesus more understandable. She said dumbing down Christianity to make it more accessible. I think there's some truth to that.
Taking out the mystery.
Taking out the mystery.
Mystery is, because in a rational world where rationalism is so important to us.
There's that desire to be able to identify and classify and put a nice label on it.
Right. And understand, to be able to understand it. Make it so it fits in our past brain.
One of the difficulties I have is just this idea of, well, it's the sacrifice on the cross. Does that mean that if somebody believes that Jesus, really honestly believes that Jesus died on the cross, in fact, does that mean that doctrine is not important? The heretics is not important? I know Paul says at one point, a man who's a heretic after 2 or 3 admonitions, avoid. So what do we do? If someone really believes in Jesus but holds heretical views, do we associate? Do we avoid? Those kinds of things are troubling, or I don't understand how to handle that.
I think Paul gives good advice to confront heresy and then to avoid heretics. Any kind of final judgment is out of my hands. If someone believes Jesus died for them on the cross, well, it is out of my hands, and it's even that's even in the prayer book, actually. The Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. The Apostles' Creed is the creed that says you can be if you believe this, you can be baptized. The Apostles' Creed does not have a clear statement about the Trinity. That's left for the Nicene Creed. The Apostles' Creed is the minimal standard for being a Christian. The Nicene Creed is the statement of Christian orthodoxy. And so it's even in our prayer book that one can be baptized and still be working towards accepting a full understanding of the Trinity. Infants, So as far as where that line is drawn, I'm glad it's out of my hands. But I think if someone is teaching heresy, then confront them, and if they keep teaching heresy, then you disassociate from them. Father Michael.
Following up on what Mary was saying, at the beginning you were talking about how there was one God. Jesus said, God, I and the Father are one and one. But you have one, and then you have plus one. And we can't get our heads around 1 plus 1 equals 1. And so we have to somehow get our logical brain to accept how 1 plus 1 is 1, and so we create these kinds of heresies.
Well, I think that the problem is that we're focusing on the numbers and not the attributes.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
We can say, the Trinity is logical. All right. If we said there are 3 gods and 1 God, that would be a contradiction. If we said there are 3 persons in 1 person, that would be a contradiction. But we distinguish between God as essence and personhood. And so we... I'm pretty sure that's heretical. But it's a way of what we're talking about here, wrapping our minds around the idea. I'm at 1 hour and 5 seconds. I said 6:30, 7:30. I'll catch Dale here. And then.
From the pastoral side of it, maybe this is the pastoral side of it. With a heretic, you serve communion.
I think that the standard is notoriety. I mean, if someone says I'm struggling with the doctrine of the Trinity, I would serve them communion. If they were standing out on the street corner with a sign saying the Trinity is bogus, I would not. Did I pass, Father Alex? Okay.
Let's honor our time commitment and stop there. I would say